So welcome to everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you so much for making the time to join this important conversation. I am delighted to have these amazing panelists here with us today. For those of you who are new to an ADN event, we are the African Diaspora Network. My name is Omolai Oyudo. I am the Director of Programs and Operations here at ADN. We are a nonprofit organization based in Silicon Valley. We bring together Africans in the diaspora, descendants of Africa, and friends and allies of Africa together to improve the continent and the communities that the diaspora lives in. We do this through knowledge sharing, knowledge exchange, public and private partnerships, social entrepreneurship, impact, and innovation. We have a few different accelerator programs, both accelerator programs for African enterprises on the continent. And we also have an accelerator program for Africans, diaspora and descendants of Africa who live in the US. And so both of these accelerator programs connect entrepreneurs with mentors, network, and training to help them accelerate their businesses. We also have a series of convenings, including our African Diaspora Investment Symposium happening once a year, often in Silicon Valley, but this year we're going to be in Washington, D.C. And then we also have our Impact and Innovation Forums, which are a series of conversations, both virtual and in person or hybrid, throughout the year, allowing our audience to connect directly with amazing experts in various fields. And so, lo and behold, you are at one of those such impact and innovation forums. So I again welcome all of you and thank you all so much for being here. We have such a treat planned for you today because the conversation that we're going to be having is an exciting and dynamic one and a very timely one. So if you will just allow me to set some context for why we are having this conversation today. As many of you know, there is a lot of geopolitical shifts going on around the world, not just in the US, but also in the UK and a lot of other areas. As those geopolitical shifts happen, what has been affected is funding to critical programs that enable enable communities to build sustainable livelihoods and futures, right? And in the wake of a lot of these funding cuts, a lot of organizations, particularly grassroots organizations, are wondering what next? Where do we go from here, right? And here at the African Diaspora Network, we have been saying for the past several years that in order to actualize the true potential of the African continent and the amazing people who live there and the diaspora and the areas that the diaspora lives in, we in the diaspora and the Friends of Africa and Africans themselves, those who stay on the continent, who still live on the continent, we have to come together and work collaboratively to solve these global solutions, these global problems. So find solutions to what the problems that are quite local, but also global in many ways. So for an example, climate change, right? That is a global problem, but it has very local effects on day-to-day livelihoods of everyone. So in order to solve these problems, we have to come together. We have to look at our past to apply it to our present in order to build for our future. And so we wanted, in honor of Women's History Month, we wanted to learn from the amazing women who champion bringing their community together to solve problems, right? What are the lessons learned? What are the best practices? What are the solutions that have gotten our community through other difficult periods that we can apply to this current one, right? So just because funding has been cut in a lot of aid budgets does not mean doom and gloom for the communities who were benefiting from those funding cuts. There are other solutions out there, whether that's new funding streams or just collaborative partnerships that leverage on already existing resources, right? And I think that the diaspora particularly is attuned to these shifts in disasters in to these shifts and disasters that occur. We often see whenever there is a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, it is the diaspora who sends remittances back to the continent in order to create a safety net for their loved ones, right? And so how can we take that safety net that the diaspora often fills in? How can we make that sustainable? How do we create systems that allow us to not have to rely on, one-on-one gifts, but rather sustainable, transformational solutions that ensure that when disasters happen, the safety net is already there, right? That is the conversation that we wanted to have today, and that, ADN has been having in various ways for the past couple years, but also moving into the future. We want to co-create these solutions with you. And so it is my immense honor to bring together this amazing panel today, to have this discussion and learn from the experts who have been there, who have been creating collaborative solutions, creating community-led solutions to everyday problems, but also global problems. And so without further ado, I would love to introduce you to our panelists today, who are going to be walking us through some of the solutions that they have created in the past for bringing together their communities and working together, doing, ensuring there's collective action on our shared problems. And so I would like to first introduce Patty Siyanga, who is an amazing development practitioner who works on uh, the African non-state actors forum. And so, Patty, over to you to introduce your fellow panelists, and thank you all so much.
Malaya, thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. If you're like me, you're chasing the sun somewhere, and you're based out of Europe. This is what we do these days during the spring. Or if you are joining us from Africa or from the Pacific, from the Americas, you are all welcome to this conversation. I always say that a panel is there to lead us and trigger a lot of what is inside a lot of us, and we recognize that the stellar panel that is here with us is going to hopefully motivate you and inspire you to share in this space and beyond some of the very important collective action that we see around the world coming from African women and African women, people of African descent who are women and are in the diaspora. And this will essentially be important to keep the conversation going under the umbrella of African Diaspora Network, and indeed in other spaces that you're working in. Now we have a star panel, and I'm hoping, Omalaya, that we'll be able to post also some of their bios so that we can really get straight into it. But without much further ado, let me just at least give you a snippet. Henrietta Bankole Olusuni, who is the Vice President at the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisory, and she has been leading efforts there, working together with different partners and really trying to see how can philanthropy be coexist in this world to pursue a just world. And she has held various positions in different spaces, and Henrietta will really be also very interesting to hear about some of the important work that you have done in digital financing, from innovation, but then also indeed talking about the important work that you have done on some of the committees that you have been involved with in Nigeria. So really glad that you took time to join us on this panel today. And then we have Annika Hobbs, who is a visionary retail strategist, and we'll hear more about the work that you have done there in, not just, going beyond that fashion retail brand industry in the US, but really also talking a lot about, your extended experience in international travel. But more specifically, how did you bring all that and become a founder and chief of curator of Nubian Human? And I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, Annika. And of course, your CV and profile just has so much wealth in terms of some of the leadership, some of the awards that you've also won. So will also be very interesting to hear in the context of our celebration today, because indeed it is a celebration. And last but not the least, Vaina Black. And Vaina, you will also correct my pronunciation. I'm using my mother tongue, as you can hear, in pronouncing some of the names. And is the Executive Global Director of Sustainability and Impact at RGA, and she'll tell us a little bit more about that. And a lot of experience that comes out of the creative industry, but also particularly noting that you've had this passion to look at sustainability and impact, and also looking at the humanitarian aspects that you have led, some of the initiatives that you've worked around that have also crossed indeed international borders. So Vaina, Annika, and Henrietta, really glad to be your moderator for this afternoon. And we'll go straight into it. And once again, just to check, for those who are joining us, you are welcome to put into the chat as we go along. Tell us where you're joining from, interact with our guests so they can really feel that you're there in the room, put some questions, and whatever indeed comes to mind as you as you are sharing, as you are in the room here with us. We will be glad to hear from you within the chat, and we will have a moment for us to engage. Now we've got a couple of questions, and I will kick off with Henrietta. And here we're trying to sort of look at the space of collective action for change, right? And Henrietta, with the efforts that you have led uh, working for Rockefeller Foundation, what do you really see as sort of some of those best practices in this space? And as you talk to us about the best practices, it would be interesting to hear where you've seen success in dealing with some of the challenges at a social level, at an economic level, and a political level, and particularly when you're talking about working within African and diaspora communities. Henrietta, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And good day to everyone who has joined us today. And thank you to the Africa Diaspora Network for this invite. Always a joy to talk about Africa, diaspora, development of our motherland. And thank you for the question, Paddy, and to my co-panelists. It's lovely to be here with you too. And so your question is really very interesting to me because in 2023, we at RPA launched a Foresights and Futures community of practice that comprised of very thoughtful foundations, nonprofit partners to collectively engage in applied learning and explore ways to help philanthropy better understand what's coming next and how to design for it, to have adaptable, innovative, and equitable coping strategies. Of course, we all see the changes since January 20th alone. And so for us, it was really an imperative to transform ourselves in order to transform our future. And that community of practice deliberately has global participation and representation. And we have had several touch points since it was launched, I think, in 2023, including a convening, which we called a Foresight and Innovation Beehive in Nairobi, Kenya, in December 2024. And what we were trying to do was to explore and learn best practices that could help us drive meaningful social, economic, and political change for the future, which of course will be meaningful for not only Africa, but for also diaspora communities as well. And so some of the key best practices just coming out of that work, the first thing I will talk about is around intentionality in foresight and futures thinking. Now, it's not something that is very common, to actually actively plan, but it's something that is ingrained in us in Africa. And so one of the things that we were emphasizing in that community of practice is the importance of anticipatory governance, helping communities plan for long-term change rather than reacting to crises, which is what we see all over the world. A classic example is how, for example, African indigenous systems, such as the Maasai leadership succession model, could be adapted to create stronger community-driven transitions in leadership and policy making. We explored something we found useful was backcasting, which is really a strategy that envisions a desired future and then helps you to build pathways to try to achieve it, ensuring that change is intentional and sustainable. And so, for me, the key word is really around planning for it. The second thing I will talk about is around community-driven solutions and peer learning. In Africa, given our history and certainly for African diasporans, a key thing is rather than having solutions imposed on us or, it's the best practice approach is to have a set or to center a lived experience approach, as well as to be able to amplify local voices. And so for many of the projects that we do, what we find is the drive and the push, especially as we set up collaborative projects, to ensure that we're centering the lived experiences and amplifying local voices and giving agency to the communities that are being served. So, of course, we are all, friends of diaspora or diasporans or Africans. And the power of storytelling in Africa is a serious tool for resilience. And of course, when you think about even orature, which is our African oral traditions that helps us to preserve our history, mobilize communities, and inspire action, just helping us explore how we blend our history, performance, music, narrative, and fostering that collective understanding, mobilization, and policy advocacy. If we think about the powerful stories, for example, of Fumilayo Ransome Kuti of Nigeria or Winnie Mandela of South Africa, when in their days they led collective action for social justice and democratic justice, for example. The third thing I will talk about is around utilizing philanthropy to bridge policy and private sector engagement. Multi-sector partnerships is important. And one of the key insights that we have is that the interconnectedness of philanthropic work with governance, economic inclusion, and business systems cannot be underestimated or understated. And so through very deliberate collaborations with the communities that we serve, or regional networks such as East Africa Philanthropy Network, we're able to facilitate partnerships that link funders, policymakers, and grassroots organizations, ensuring that resources are going to the people that need them the most, the communities. And so the last thing I really will say is that for collective action, the success really lies in being able to plan, anticipate, co-create, and sustain those solutions. And what we found is that collective action is most effective when it is structured, inclusive, and forward-thinking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henrietta. I think in your sharing, I like I don't think it's just a choice of words, but it's actually indeed a choice of strategy, right? How intentional a strategy can actually be, but then also delivering on the promise to ensure that you've got transformation leadership that is engraved in power of the community, but then also talking about the power of indigenous knowledge, what that means, from this foresight perspective. And thank you so much for sharing. And as we make just a slight segue, when we look at what Henrietta has shared, Vaina, from a perspective where we want to understand, there's a lot of global movements that we see, but we also know that global movements are a bit like, the big noise at the wedding, and then the local impact happens within the marriage. And so when you think about, these comparisons, when you look at individuals and organizations, how do you see them connecting and contributing to, global African-led movements, and not just movements for the sake of it, but movements that really will push us towards sustainable development and community empowerment? Raina?
Hi, everyone. So lovely to be here with you all, and thank you for this question. This is something that I think about often, and I'll just say that from my perspective, one thing that has been really successful at RGA, which is an ad agency that I oversee sustainability and impact, has been really leveraging people's skills that they use every day for their, jobs, for social impact and for social causes, and also bringing awareness to other organizations that are already existing instead of encouraging folks to start something new. The reason why I say that is because there are a lot of great people and a lot of great organizations that are doing amazing work. And I think that in this day and age, where virality is a hot topic and people want to go viral and, be able to put their name and stamp on things, they want to start their own thing. But I'd say leaning into or I should say leveraging the skills that you already have. So for instance, I oversee Make Good, which is a program, our sustainability, social impact, and volunteer program. And so what we do is we support underrepresented small nonprofits and social good businesses. And we provide them with our creative services and strategic skills. And I'll give you an example of one of the projects that we've worked on in the past. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we partnered with a group called Black Women for Black Lives to help to support their efforts to get African students out of Ukraine safely into safety. And we also created a NFT, a digital NFT, an editorial NFT to raise over $30,000 to contribute to their almost $500,000 fund. And so what we did, right, like we acted very quickly and partnered with a group that was literally already on the ground, already on touch with everyone, trying to get them out instead of like creating some new program to support the refugees. And so I'd say in terms of like what individuals can do is really to tap into their networks and just doing like a quick Google or ChatGPT search at this point, and leaning into the skills that they may use on a daily basis to support some of these goals, because we definitely have a long ways to go. Last year, I think it was last year or the year before, the UN picked out 5 sustainable development goals that they really wanted to amplify in a campaign called Forward Faster, so that we could reach those goals by 2030, because we are significantly behind.
Thank you so much, Raina, and the experience that you've shared from Ukraine and trying to leverage organizations that were already working on the ground really reminds me of engagement from an African diaspora perspective here in Europe at the time I was living in the Balkans, where indeed you saw a lot of new organizations trying to come up, and indeed, yet there were so many more that were efficient on the ground, particularly led by students, and also quite a lot that were led by women. So I think that again, brings in the emphasis of leveraging leveraging on efforts that are being made by other organizations, synergizing. And I think we should hear a little bit more about, where you sort of see this leveraging of the personal and individual skills a bit later. You can tell us a little bit more about it. Thinking about our audience, I know that both Henrietta and Vaina have just shared on some of these initiatives. So if you've got, links, reports, and other information that you would like to share in the chat, Henrietta and Vaina, just feel free to do that so that people could connect with some of these initiatives to understand what collective action looked like. And then as we move on and take a detour into looking at the role of culture and heritage. And here, Annika, given your experience and the work that you're doing, how do you see cultural identity influencing the way African and diaspora communities organize, but also how they lead and what you've seen in the space of co-creating solutions?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. And I'm excited to be on this panel. And also thank you to everyone who's been dropping in the chat, because if you see me moving, I'm probably clicking on your link just to learn more about everyone that's here. But yeah, cultural identity, I think, is everything when it comes to, especially us, as you said, Africans in the diaspora. Identity is probably the foundation of all of that, of how we lead, organize, come together, understand community, and all of those things. I think as we continue to share and have these opportunities, one thing that I always talk about is that the internet makes the world very small. So as we continue to, as Henrietta said, share our stories, whether it's here or, here in the diaspora or on the African continent, I think we start to learn and understand that we are connected. I know for me, it wasn't until I went to Kenya, and I started to see my family there on the ground, and not literally, but I'm seeing images and, movement and communities that are very similar to my family in the South. So I think as we see, we share our history, we share our traditions, and as Henrietta said, our lived experiences, we start to learn that we are very much the same, that we are very much connected, and that there's a shared heritage that we should probably speak upon and talk about more so that we can continue to build bridges together. I'm always thinking about collective upliftment. I think that's something, as Nubian Human, that's something that we always try to do, and we work in a way, and I would say even as Africans or diasporans, in an ecosystem way. I think we need to start thinking, instead of hierarchy, that ecosystems, that we all have what we need, and how do we come together and make that happen. And so I think the more that we learn about our culture, that's what bridges us together. Like whenever I think about like what Nubian Human does, we've worked with about, and I come from a retail e-com space. So everything for me is fashion, it's art, it's food, it's fabric, it's color, it's language, it's all those creative things that sometimes we don't really think about, but it is really an important part when it comes to culture, and it has a place in retail and in e-commerce and in commerce altogether. So I think for us, identity is about bridging all of that together in order for us to feel more as one. There's nothing greater than us as Africans and in the diaspora functioning as if we are one. The waters do not have to separate us. The language does not have to separate us. I think there is a spiritual connection that we need to utilize and understand about each other. And once we use that, that is the powerful force that we need. As we spoke, January 20th completely changed, not only here in the US, but across the globe. And it continues to do so. And it continues to create barriers, global barriers, political barriers. But I think for us, if we understand that we have that oneness, that barrier no longer exists. So having an identity, understanding ourselves, is what connects us. We've seen this with like the Pan-African movement. We see this within a susu, for example, if you know what a susu is, or, in Jamaica it's called a partner. Those are economic things that we can do together to uplift each other. A susu, you don't need a bank. We just need community, and that's it. And I think as long as we continue to think in that way, we'll build culture. We will build businesses together. We will be internally sustainable, and that's what we need. I think that is more and more and more of what we need. I had a conversation this morning with a brand in Lagos, who's coming here to do work with us. And the buyer of that company said, I actually know you. I've been following you for a while because you were one of our first buyers in the US. And that right there is like completely what my purpose is to bring the culture, show that the culture is connected, and utilize that in a space of, utilize the culture as a way to make commerce and build business. Because my goal is to continue to filter money into her business, to hire people that look like us, to, have makers that look like us, so that we can keep that ecosystem going.
Thank you, Annika. You just took me back, and I was thinking, if we were in a physical room, and this is what you miss by being in physical spaces, we'll be able to see the dress, we'll be able to talk about the identities that come. We also understand that a lot of the fabric that comes out of Africa has a lot of messages. And for me, when I attend meetings and I see people in their African prints, I want to understand what that fabric means. I want to understand. And so I think these are parts of the things that we miss, but hopefully those who will make it to the Addis in 2025 or Malayo should have a check on, what can we learn just by dress and culture. But thank you so much in sharing that, and how, identity is really central, isn't it? And you got me thinking about second generation diaspora, which is something that we talk about quite a lot in the space also of public policy, and saying that probably the strategies that worked even when governments or private sector or anyone else who wants to engage with diaspora that worked with first generation diaspora may not work with second generation, because second generation want to connect differently. How my mother, who migrated many years ago, connects with the African continent is very different with how I connect with home, and how my sister, 10 years younger than me, who never lived on the continent, connects. And when you talked about this visit, Annika, just shows that, connection also has to come with contact, which sometimes we are often forgetting. So thank you for sharing these experiences. Perhaps before, we will segue and open the floor to also some more some comments. And so please put some questions in the chat. Henrietta, when we think about the global challenges, now we're in this space where, I think the United Nations had issued, accelerate action, I think, as part of the Women's Day. What do you say? They sort of always have a theme, but then also we've known that we're in the last decade of action. I call it the last years of the last decade of action. So we're really at that timeline. But we also see different shifts in the world. If you're coming out of the US, it's almost a no-brainer of the kind of dynamics we see. But even here in Europe, we see so many changes, and these impacting also on development on the African continent. So, when you think about all these shifting dynamics, how can African diaspora communities maintain resilience? And, how do they continue to really put innovation and development as drivers?
Thank you. That's a great question. And we certainly recognize that, Africa and diaspora communities are vital beacons or agents of resilience. You just need to look at our history to see where we've all come from and how we have survived over time. And certainly innovation and development, even in the face of this shifting global dynamics, is part of life for us. And when I say for us, I mean Africa and diaspora communities as well. And so if I go back to the work that we've done, even around our Foresight and Futures community of practice, what we found is that first and foremost, to be able to, think or to be able to put in place these strategies, we need to engage, or we need to be engaging leaders, philanthropists, practitioners, to try to navigate and plan. The thing about foresight is that you're putting yourself in the space of, what do I think the future will look like, and how can I be prepared for it, and how can I plan for it? And so some of the key strategies that we've seen is really part of the work that the African Diaspora Network is doing, which is, first, we absolutely need to deepen our diaspora-led economic and philanthropic networks. So economic shifts, whether we're looking at the impact of capital, different types of capital, mean that diaspora communities, because they do hold some significant economic power in whichever countries or continents they've landed, have the ability to create the shift on the continent. So they need to be rethinking investment, philanthropy, as well as development models that they're using to engage on the continent. That's the first. And certainly there are very many case studies where diaspora funds, for example, the amount of diaspora remittances that are coming into the continent, and where those funds are being deployed strategically to support entrepreneurship, social innovation, and education across Africa. And so it really just reinforces the role of peer networks in helping to sustain resilience. And part of what philanthropy can do is really not just about the financial contributions, but also about knowledge sharing, mentorship, systems building, which is and systems change, which is why the work that African Diaspora Network is doing is so important. The second thing I will talk about is around technology, the use of technology and AI as tools for resilience. We cannot ignore technology. We need to engage, we need to explore the use of AI and digital technologies to unlock and find out how we can utilize it to strengthen diaspora engagement, preserve our cultural identities, and propagate it, as Annika has spoken about so eloquently, as well as drive new models of governance. So I'll give you an example. There's an NGO in Kenya, the Next Step Foundation, that, and this is a foundation that is changing narratives in Africa by empowering persons with disabilities, women and youth through innovative employment initiatives. They utilize AI to drive their mental health support for their community. Now, this is a great example of how technology can be adapted to meet very specific community needs, thereby ensuring that we have accessibility regardless of geographical location. The potential of decentralized digital platforms to empower not only Africa, but the Africa diaspora communities helps us to foster global collaborations, ethical fundraising, and grassroots collaboration and collective action and organization. And we cannot underestimate it. The last point I will make around technology is around representation. Given that not a lot of Africans, diasporans, or women for that matter have been involved in the evolution and development of AI, it is important that we engage actively because it's really a case of garbage in, garbage out. They need to have as many of us utilizing and feeding and fueling those engines so they understand who we are, what we're about, what is important to us. So when we ask, ChatGPT to describe for us what an African woman looks like, it doesn't come up with something so abstract that even to the next gen of diasporans, it is something completely alien. So we absolutely need to engage with technology to ensure that we're represented. Our culture, our stories are there. Last thing I will talk about is around political advocacy and policy and influence. And given that, there's increasing political polarization across the world, everywhere, we're seeing it everywhere. Part of what, our work also emphasizes is the role of diaspora communities in helping to shape policies directly in their homelands as well as in their host nations. So becoming engaged politically and becoming and actually participating in policy making and policy shifts that we absolutely need in the world today. So, for example, in Kenya, in the Kenya Senate, they've got a Kenyan Senate Futures Caucus where they're actually exploring innovative legislative models that is helping to integrate foresight methodologies into governance, so that you're not only ensuring or you're not only focused on short-term political cycles, but you're ensuring long-term strategic policy making that is tied into the reality of our ever and fast-changing world. I think that last point I will make is around the fact that we must move from being reactive to being the architects of our own futures, because if we don't do it, nobody else is going to do it for us. And so we need to be making sure that as Africans and as diaspora Black communities, when not only having the tools from a resilient standpoint of adapting to change, but we're actively shaping the future and shaping the change the way we want to and we're built to deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henrietta. And I, so on point on the role that technology plays in a lot of different ways. But particularly, I liked your point on some of the examples that you talked about in terms of representation, and then also these planning aspects, right? Where do we look also a little bit deeper? I feel that there are some niche pockets where we don't sort of look at as well. What is the role of peer networks? If I had to ask everyone here, how many WhatsApp groups are you in? And if you're like me, a member of the diaspora, I'm in several WhatsApp groups. And a friend of mine told me that she sat down to evaluate how much time we spend and how much depth sometimes that particularly if it's an alumni diaspora alumni, let's say WhatsApp group, what is the power that is there in it, that is latent within some of these WhatsApp groups where we seem to share quite a lot, and how do we steer that and move? And probably Baina, how do individuals like that, how do we tap into the social skills that are sort of in there and embedded through places of trust that we've embedded through the different groups that we're a part of? Maybe both for Baina and for Annika, and Annika, you can come in first here. Let's talk a little bit about the future before we open for questions. Now we can, Omalayo has explained, and for those who were not here, ADN will be hosting the 10th anniversary of the African Diaspora Investment Summit. I was there last year in San Francisco, really great place for networking, and also an important space to have very critical and serious conversations, particularly in the world that we are in today. And sort of thinking about, as ADN is approaching this investment summit, what would you think are some of the most critical areas where collective action is needed in the next decade? So Annika, do you want to go first?
Sure. One of the things that I think is extremely critical is the continued investment in our culture, commerce, and community. I can't say it enough. So one of the things is our businesses, scaling our businesses. So looking at community-driven investment, how can we figure out ways in which we can utilize cultural sustainability within our businesses? As Baina said, coming together, it doesn't always have to be that you're great at this, so you start your own business, but how can we come into the fold of something that already exists and making that as one powerful thing and a lot stronger? We move faster together. That's one thing that I hold true as a foundation. Cross-continental trade and global trade is significantly more important, especially right now. So figuring out how we can have a red thread to our through our supply chains. One thing that I've always truly believed in is that everything that we need, every resource that we need comes from the continent. I don't doubt that by any way, whether it's the agriculture, fabric, knowledge, anything, healing as a community. I think it all comes from the African continent, and how is us, those in the West, do that in a way that is supportive and not as a way of our colonizers, if you will, more in that way of community. But I do believe that having our own supply chains, manufacturing, building communities together is what we need to do. Ownership of culture, which is what Henrietta said earlier. So making sure that the representation that we do have from a place of IP and preservation, how do we maintain that and collect that? But making sure that we actually own that, not only own it in which it is put out into the world, but own it in a very financial type of way. I think that's what our counterparts do. And then that's where we lose that. We put it out there and then it gets taken, rather than we own it, we put it out there, and then we fight if they try to take it, which is very different. And technology, like fintech, edutech, all of those things, somehow, some way, us having a digital infrastructure is really, really important. The internet is not only there for entertainment, it is there for us to do business. It is there for us to grow. We need to definitely utilize technology. And I would say the last thing is real estate. Owning our lands. We see this happening in South Africa now, what has happened due to apartheid. There's so many conversations now of what is our land and what is it that we rightfully own. So I definitely think understanding the importance and significance, not only for us, but the legacy of us, is owning that land and having the real estate belonging to ourselves. So those are where I see are the most critical areas for us to focus on as a collective.
Thank you, Annika.
Yeah.
And I was just, Vaina, go ahead. Perfect timing.
I was just gonna add and pick up on the importance of us and our familiarity with technology. Obviously, we're all talking about AI right now, and one thing that I'm gonna say, something that may be a bit contradictory, but is important. As important as technology is, I also want to say to everyone to remember our old methods as well and the things that worked in the past. I call myself a paper person. I have so many notebooks and just way too much. I just carry way too much stuff, right? But there's power in the pen, and also going back to our indigenous roots of what we did before, just in case technology fails us one day. And I'm not in the US right now, I'm in Brazil. But what's happening in the US with the planes falling out of the sky, which I have my opinions on that, And technology being down sometimes, it's really important for us to use the systems that have stood the test of time. And also with that, when it comes to technology, I want to make sure that we are not left behind, and that we lean in a lot to the developments that are happening in AI. There's a project, a part of the program that I run, called PAM, and it's a pitch AI mentor tool that we created. We co-created with an organization based in Berlin called Founderland. And this was developed and specifically designed for women of color founders to help them to practice their pitches, not just for when they get in rooms with venture capitalists, but also when they get in front of banks, to get a loan, a business loan, or if they're pitching an idea internally. And so Pam has really enabled the founders who have been in this beta program to practice when they don't get the opportunities to. And I bring up Pam because these are the types of programs, initiatives, software, technologies, platforms that we should be creating that are for us, for sure, And I go to like quite a few AI for good or social impact or sustainability conferences and panels or events. And what I hear a lot is that people are behind. We talk about AI a lot, but people are not embedding it into their everyday lives. And one stat that I heard, or suggestion rather, is that you should be utilizing at least 5 AI tools a day to stay up to date. And so if you are not, keep that in mind. Like, yes, ChatGPT is becoming the replacement for Google, right? But there's Claude, there's so many other platforms that we could be utilizing, and I don't want us to fall behind. And I also want us to just try and lean into things that we need for our communities, right? Creating databases. We can work so much faster now with AI. And so I'd say like, yes to where we need to be looking, for the next 10 years, like, yes, leaning into technology, but also not forgetting the indigenous systems that worked for us a really long time ago. Also, I'd say, digital connectivity as well, and not leaving our family members, our community members who may not be so tech savvy, or not even necessarily just with technology, but just what's going on in the world. I think one of the biggest shockers for people in the US was this, recent election. And when you look at the map and see how many people voted or who weren't the 92%, right? And I thought about like my own family members who may not have been so aware of like, what the results of this particular election could have happened. So in whatever region you are, just making sure that we're talking to our community members and sharing knowledge. Like, this sounds like a no-brainer, but I think that like for many of us on this call, we may be like very advanced in our awareness and understanding, and not necessarily remembering to include like our neighbors. When I moved back to Brooklyn from Brazil, I got a lot more involved in my own community, my physical community, because I was very hyper focused on like globalization. And so I've been taking like the global aspects of my life and applying them locally. So I'd also say like doing more local and regional work as well is really important for us to lean into. And yeah, just continuing to like educate ourselves and share that knowledge, and not being gatekeepers about it. And again, going back to some of the old ways of maybe like printing out flyers, and I'm the sustainability person saying this, right? And slipping it under our neighbors' doors, or putting it, on lamp posts or something. But I just think that like the knowledge sharing, leaning into technology, and not forgetting our indigenous systems that have worked are what I think we need to lean into more as we go into figuring out what these next 10 years, heck, what the next 2 years look like for us.
Thank you so much, Raina, for sharing in on those really critical points, but also some very examples of how we really still need to be conscious the fact that we don't forget the old ways as we embrace technology. So we really find out how is technology taking us further, but conscious and aware of where we are today. In the space of education, we've talked about children losing the ability to write by hand and what that has meant in terms of, development for the children, but also other skills that they actually need to be able to use technology also much more progressively, but also in terms of social skills that they would have to build that come all through the act of writing. I was listening to Chimamanda Ngozi. I don't know if how many of you have listened to her interviews talking about AI and in the space of writing. And basically, and if you haven't, a Google search will help with that. And basically saying, yeah, she was out a couple of years of not writing because she had brain fog. A woman who had a baby had brain fog, and you have to wait it out. And of course, I think in one of the interviews, she's been asked about how she could leverage technology, and she talks about how creativity could also be taken away from that. So we can see how it can be quite powerful for one community, and in the other way, it could trigger, maybe she would have written a totally different book if she hadn't waited for so long. But then maybe it wouldn't have been triggered by her natural abilities. So a lot I think that we can see out of AI, but also in talking about not falling back, I often talk about life experiences of living in China for a number of years. And I remember that in China, and I'm talking nearly now, maybe 6 years ago, we were using the QR code like it was everywhere. You had the QR code. And you came into spaces within Europe, within the US, also within Africa, there were other developments, but you don't really see people using QR code. And now QR code is the best thing that ever happened. You have to have a QR code attached to your website, a QR code attached to your business card, a QR code attached to everything. So I would also say, to what extent do we look east for some of how they've leveraged innovation, but also been very conscious of what they keep as sacred in terms of their cultural heritage. So I think there's a lot that we could learn even when we look into the Latin America. Your point, Annika, on real estate and owning the land, I'm quite humbled when I think about particularly women owning land, because in different spaces within the African continent, it's not automatic that, for instance, if a father leaves inheritance to his children, that women would naturally inherit. In a lot of countries, women do not inherit land, for instance, because it's assumed that they would marry and move somewhere else. And so there are so many things that are around access to land for women as well that needs to be tackled into. And Henrietta reminded me a bit of talking a bit more about how do we engage then in the political space, which is something we're trying to do at the African Non-State Actors platform, where we have diaspora actors, and talking about engaging with public policy for things that matter to diaspora, that matter to migrants, and that matter, by the way, to also trade unions, who are a very important player in this particular space, living with migrants and diaspora actors in their countries of destination. And so when I think a very last point around the African Union, they have been, in the beginning, I think we were really skewed into, well, we need to drive our message across to European partners. We need to drive our message across to other people on the other side of the continent. And now we're leaning more and more to passing the message on to our countries. They issue us with these passports. We come from these. Some of us are still very much attached to these countries. I only have one passport. So if Germany tells me to leave anywhere today, I only have one destination to go. And so it's very important, as you said, Henrietta, how do we go back into development at home and the emphasis around development at home? And the African Union theme this year is the Year of Justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. And there you go, as Annika, you said, there's a shared space where we can connect. And you see also through the United Nations People of African Descent platform, that those themes is where we could actually meet. So there's spaces and where we can gather a lot of energy for the very important work that many African diaspora out there are doing, and particularly also women, to just uplift the role that women play. We're going to have a moment to engage with our audience. And I think, Omalayo, I may also allow people to just speak, isn't it? If just a raise of hands, would be great. And if you're not able to share, there is so much that has been shared in the chat. Just to say again, thank you for all the introductions. I see Tanzanians are in the group. Mambo VP, place very, very close to my heart, that welcomed me as the first country that I lived as a diasporan, coming from Zambia. And I see many more that are in the chat. Thank you for the introductions. It's always very important for us to connect. Please feel free to ask a question to our panelists, or you just want to share a reflection because something resonated with the work that you're doing. And so if we don't have a raise of hands because you don't have a question for the audience, we also ask that you just share from your space for some of the questions that we've asked. Where are you in this space? Are you engaged in any way around social impact? What is changing around you? What kind of strategies are working for you? What kind of examples would you like to share with us? Also, what are some of those challenges that you continue to see, and you think this would be a space for us indeed to talk about the kind of collective action that we need going forward? I see that there's in the chat a question from...
Yes. Patty, there's a question early on from Tala. Tala, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your question yourself, but it was directed to Henrietta. So Tala, I'll give you a moment to unmute and ask yourself. Otherwise, I can read out your question for you. I know yours was one of the first ones that came through. So I'll give Tala a moment. Okay,
Thank
I
you.
see you unmuting, so go ahead.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Yes, thank you again for the very insightful presentations. I work in the futures and foresight space. And often when we are working in particular in Africa, there is a tendency for donors, we see this with USAID, to dictate the agenda rather than allowing the funding to go directly to community-based organizations to address and solve the problem themselves. I'm wondering if Madam Asuna or any of the other panelists have comments on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Tala, for your question. And I think there are different, I think there are different ways to compartmentalize the response. I think first is that foresight and futures work is completely new. In the sense, so funding in that space is really very limited in the first instance. The second thing around, every major funder has their own agenda, for want of a better way to put it.
Yep.
And to the point I was making around diasporans and Africans actually creating their own philanthropic networks is really, really very important, because when you have the capital, you dictate what the agenda is. So that's the second thing. The fact that we need to focus on actually funding and, generating our own capital to fund projects that are important to us and to our communities. That's my second response. Thirdly is around, yes, I think there is indeed some measure of racism many times, depending on where the proposals are coming from, the types of topics and things like that that they're covering. There's a wide range of reasons why funding won't go to community-based organizations. But with systems change and the work that we're doing in systems change, we're trying to change that thinking to drive and give the communities, or for funders to give the communities and community-based organizations the agency, as well as the freedom to utilize the funding as they deem fit. So it used to be the case that you would seldom see, general operating grants, right? Where you can actually just go do what you want with the money. They're typically very, very, very specific and tied to very specific initiatives. But we're beginning to see some shifts, and we're beginning to see some change in that regard, where the funders are actually now providing on a trust basis funding for projects that are not necessarily tied to specific initiatives, and as a way of showing some measure of trust in organizations that are based within communities. I'll stop there. Maybe Anika and Baina have also perspectives to share on this.
Yeah, thank you, Henrietta. And your point about, the funders having their own agenda is so correct, right? Like head on the head, or head on the nail, I think it is. Um, so for instance, when we give money to organizations that we work with, we're looking for something really specific for them to use it on. Also, and the reason why I say this is because when we were developing the Make Good for Businesses program, I did a lot of research on like what did businesses need. I found that most of like 62% of small businesses didn't have websites, right? Now, one can argue, is that relevant in this day and age for them to have a website? But it was less about the website and more about like a digital presence. Were they leveraging the internet to the full extent that they could to attract more customers, right? And so some of the grants that we've given have been specifically for digital usage, right? Like whether or not it's to get their website up, to trademark their new name that we created. Branding is a huge thing for us. This is another thing that I think is not talked about enough, is just like the bias that comes, like the quiet bias that comes from the way things look and are packaged. It seems simple, but it's very, very true, so we do a lot of rebranding for these, especially like smaller organizations that we work for. This is something like Takumbo is on the line right now. We did with Black Women for Black Lives when we were doing the work with Ukraine. There was so much noise. There was a lot of scams that were happening too. Like we can't ignore that. During that time, there were tons of scams happening, and we needed to legitimize this project and this movement, and we were able to partner and bring in like our expertise in design to elevate them. And so that is a bias that comes, like you mentioned, racism, but there's other biases that come from that. But yeah, when it comes to like why the funding isn't, going to the community-based organizations, there's a lot of different reasons, but also I even say for the funders, we maybe looked at like advisors, right? And wanting to lend our expertise in a particular area, because we know that if you do this based off of previous experience, you will grow in that area, and we don't know if they'll spend it on, rent or something. And that's not to say that that's not what people need. For instance, like I mentioned, I'm in Brazil. There's a museum that we work with here, the National Afro-Brazilian Museum, and they weren't able to pay their workers for 6 months. And so while like, yes, I'm giving you money and I would like for it to improve, something related to your digital platforms, you also need to feed your staff, so like there definitely is, I'd say, more trust that is needed, but also on both sides, right? Because I think sometimes the funders may seem like you're like, oh, you're not trusting me, but it may be that I have more knowledge and wisdom to help you grow in the direction that you say that you want to. So let's trust each other on both sides. But thanks for that question.
Do we have anyone else? Kathy or Katie? I see you're on. Did you want to share some reflections? I know you've been sharing quite a lot also in the chat. Anything you'd like to share with us?
Hi there. Sure. My name's Kathy. I was just feverishly typing a message, but I'll hit send in a moment, but share it live. So per Tala and Baina's comments, I just wanted to share some insight. I attended a recent webinar on attracting the new generation of philanthropists. And it was shared that many of these folks have earned their wealth by becoming an expert in their field. That makes them risk averse in investing in local organizations in a field where they may not be the expert. And so the tip was, if you as the organization, seeking funds, can share the expertise to help that potential donor, that organization, become an expert in your field, then you're helping them to feel confident about the investment that they're going to make. And now the second piece that I'll add is I work for Alight. It's a global humanitarian organization, and our co-creation model and human-centered design model truly believes that our customers, who are people who have been forcibly displaced, are the subject matter experts. So what we are trying to do is shape a strategy that positions our customers as the subject matter experts to share this knowledge and expertise with the potential donors. So connecting them directly and taking us out as the facilitators, we are the facilitators and the coordinators and taking on the burden of it, but positioning the customers at the front to share their wisdom and expertise. So.
Okay, super. Thank you.
I love that you shared that, Kathy, because I think sometimes we get so caught up in decks and the stats that we read, and it's like we have real live people who have lived experience that we can tap into, and that is so necessary and needed, and I think it's not prioritized enough. And I think it also comes from us, well, at least in my industry, we work so fast. Like I'm working on a project right now, building out a sustainability program for a beauty brand in Asia. And we're working so fast to do something that took me almost a year to do, right? But we still got to talk to the people. And I'm really happy that you brought that point up. Like even always have, like I'd say at least like 3 people who you can tap in your subject, who can be subject matter experts in your field or your discipline, or area of focus for calls. Like always have those people you can just like WhatsApp really quick or send an email and they'll get back to you. It really makes a difference.
And I would only add that sometimes it's because of time difference, because of technology, because of other barriers, it is difficult to connect those individuals live. But then you can also do it through videos, through stories. So if it's the decks, because that is what the person wants to receive, rather than talking about the numbers and the data, talk about the people, show the people, give the bring those voices directly into the presentation.
Thanks, Kathy. Annika, did you want to add?
Yeah, just a really quick thing as an organization that has gone after funding. I think one thing as the organization or business should also look at is standing back or reaching out to also see what industries and areas that you don't think that you serve in, but you actually do. So for example, it's really easy for me to say that Nubian Human is a retailer. That's what I do. I buy, I sell, that sort of thing. But when you get really into the nitty gritty of what we actually do, I was partnering with a mentor and they were like, this is actually social impact. And so learning more about that and understanding and being more in that space and what your business does and the purpose of it within that and getting deeper into that, I started to learn that that was something else that we were able to tap into, whether it's funding or just being in certain spaces or in certain rooms. Once we started understanding that, okay, these events that you're doing, this is not just an event, but it's actually bridging cultures together and things like that. So I think having people who are outside of your business, seeing inside and being able to put words to it actually allows you to see what other industries and opportunities for funding that you could go after. There's one really huge example that I'm always, that is in the forefront of my mind is, there's a really big festival that Afropunk, for example, is a really big festival. It's traveled around the world. We won't talk about all the other things they've done. But when we think about it, we think just festival. But they've actually been able to turn their business into entertainment and media. And so once they started pushing more on the side of media, that changed the amount of money that was allowed to fund into that business. Sponsors started seeing opportunities of putting money into it because it's now actually doing really great media, especially UGC, user content, all of that stuff, instead of just seeing it as a music festival. So I say that to say, just step back as a business or somebody looking for funding. What are some other not as direct ways in which you capitalize on an opportunity for funding?
Yeah. And Annika, I think that's such an important point. I mean, to talk about also how do you rebrand or also repackage yourself towards a thematic, right? And I think often you meet a lot of diaspora that have been doing things just because that's how they've been doing them, and they didn't even know it had a name. And and then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, but you do this already, and they're like, oh, so is that the name? Is that what it's actually called? And so I think that sometimes just breaking out of these spaces and trying to find like-minded networks, and also kind of not working within silos, right? I think becomes particularly very important. How do you bring in different sectors talking together, but also how do you bring in different sources of knowledge? On the funding side, I often say that flexible funding arrangements are less and less, and then the requirements are more and more. And Baina, you gave a very good example of not realizing that sometimes what diaspora actors are looking for is institutional support. And we need to see how do we leverage that. Because if we're not able to help them step up on the institution, we're not sure if we're able to sustain some of the actions that we want to see them by front-loading funds for action-oriented, and yet, the vehicle is not moving, but we expect them to deliver the goods. But Tokumbo has the hand up. Do you want to share?
Hi, good afternoon. Sorry, I'm currently working and not in a position to turn on my video, but I just also wanted to say that, and this is a lesson that was recently reinforced to me. So I am Tokumbo Koiki, founder of London African Food Week and co-founder of Black Women for Black Lives. And I also just wanted to say that networking is so key when you're doing community and sustainable impact work. And I launched London African Food Week in 2019, and then unfortunately due to COVID and obviously other things, I had to put a pause on it. And then we restarted last year in 2025. And I connected with Bayina through social media. And again, Bayina, she really came through for Black Women for Black Lives because of the work that I'd been doing and the fact that she could see the transparency that we were doing. I connected with Omalayo through networking at a brunch event here in London when she was still in London before she deserted me and moved to Dublin. But I'm not bitter about that in any way, shape, or form. But the point that I really wanted to make is, and even today, I really wanted to make a conscious effort to interact with the panel, even though I've got my work laptop on, and also really introduce myself and connect with other panelists, because I went to a networking event a couple of weeks ago, which was an in conversation with the minister from Nigeria. And I decided to ask a question because I'm always looking for funding for London African Food Week, because I am currently bootstrapping and I've been bootstrapping this initiative and project for the last 6 years. And in the course of me asking the minister who I could get support from within the Nigerian government, somebody in the audience came to me and told me about an event at the in Tanzania next month, the UN Gastronomy for Tourism. And so I am a Nigerian and I like to finesse and ask. I truly believe if you don't ask, you don't get. So I asked her, would she do a direct introduction to the organizer, because I thought this would be a great platform to attend, to make connections and leverage my network. And from that introduction, I've now been invited to be a speaker at one of the panel events at this event. So I really think when you are at a networking event, whether it's virtual or in person, in as much as you are there because you got drawn in by either the panelists or the organizers, you also don't know who else is in the room. And so by being quiet, you are doing yourself and your amazing work a disservice, because there may be somebody who is in that audience who is part of this panel, who is part of the organizers, who's part of the audience, who could help you, whether it's funding or whether it's making an introduction to somebody else who could help you to get where you want to get to. So I think, it's really, really important that we don't hide in the shadows and we talk loudly about the work that we're doing, because sometimes we think we're working in silo and we're pushing and we're grinding and we're hustling, and it feels at the beginning of this year, I actually told my co-founder that I did not want to do London African Food Week because I was so tired of having to fund the initiative myself. But I'm now at a space where, I'm going to this, I'm going to Tanzania, I'm going to be speaking about it. And even though I still haven't gotten the funding, I'm 1 inch closer to where I want to be. So that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for sharing and just putting us in this celebratory mode. I think with, the power and the impact that speaking out in the room, but also making sure that, the people that you connect with continue to talk about it. And I can see that in the chat, we're being told what a force you are. So we're looking forward to hearing a bit more from the important work that you're doing. Thank you so much for sharing, Tokumbo. We are slowly running out of time, but Vaina, please feel free to take the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something really quickly to something you said, Patty, that I loved, right? People not realizing what they're doing and what it may ladder up to. My friend Dominique has an amazing podcast. It just launched. It's called Compost Cotton and Cornrows. And I'm putting the link in the chat now. And she talks to different Black vanguards in sustainability, because there are over 450 different ways to define sustainability. And so much of the things that are being brought to light now, we've been doing, and like not necessarily getting credit for it, which is a whole other topic I could talk about for a long time, but I will not because we're running out of time, right? But I wanted to just share this podcast because she has different people on there talking about like their version of sustainability and what they're doing, and also gives like really great tips, like going back to the earlier question of what can individuals do. Really leaning into your own interests is very important when it comes to sustainability and social impact, but also amplifying the voices, like I was mentioning before, about the community members that would be like, this is sustainability. We just always did this, but helping them to understand what does that mean now in this day and age, so that they can get the credit for what they have been doing forever. And also potentially monetizing from it, not making everything about money, but a lot of these other non-Black influencers are out here getting a lot of money for things that the diaspora has been doing forever. And I'm not for it. So I just wanted to like share that, take a listen. And yes, please, let's stay connected.
Thank you. And you reminded me a thought that had crossed my mind. I was thinking of who to connect to Tokumbo to. And I'm just thinking, not far from you in London, out of Brussels, comes an organization called the Food Bridge that does once a year in the summer a celebration of agro, everybody who's working around so it could be food processing, it could also be around food. And I'll pop that also into the chat. And I think that's what is important is for us to be able to support each other's activities. So please feel free, for those who haven't shared yet, into the chat. And then I think, Malayo, shall I hand over to you for the closing remarks?
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you, Patty. Thank you, Henrietta, Bayina, Anika. Thank you to all the people who are in the chat today. I'm just here like smiling. When we had our run of show a couple 2 days ago with the panelists, I was telling them to please forgive my fangirling, because I am just so amazed by the beautiful women who spoke to us today. And as you all can see, absolutely wonderful knowledge shared today. I'm blown away. I was typing feverishly. I should have probably used an AI tool to type for me. But like you, being a very pen to paper, old school type of person. So I'm still catching up. I'm behind the curve myself, but I catch up. I just to pull a few of the things that the panelists said today that really stuck out to me, and I'm hoping to leave the audience with. I think, first of all, something that Anika said around Susu, and Tokumba said it's called Ajo. Ajo. Tokumba, don't take my Yoruba card from me, okay? Don't take my Yoruba card from me for mispronouncing that. But I know it's kind of like, the giving circle, the ability to pool our funding together. And so I think that speaks to what we've been saying around all these old practices that we just didn't realize are modern, are now being like funded in other ways, right? Because like isn't that crowdfunding? Didn't I just describe crowdfunding? Pooling resources together. So I think, yeah, finding an outside perspective to help us see the work that we're doing and the connections it adds to modern trends, modern topics in order to amplify it, right? And I think what you said, Patty, about not working in silos, not staying in our echo chambers, I think that is extremely critical. And it speaks to what Henrietta is doing with the communities of practice, right? These are people coming together and learning best practices from different sectors. Because I imagine, Henrietta, the foundations that you bring together to have this conversation all have different fields of expertise. And so when they're able to bring that expertise, that's like, okay, from this sector and that sector and that sector, bring it together to create whole new futures, I think that is absolutely beautiful. So I think, kind of like our panelists have said, I encourage everyone who's on this call today, what is one new thing that you can do to step outside of your echo chamber today? And then while you're doing that, at the same time, I think there's a lot of this and this, however, think about this, because I remember when Bayina was speaking, yes, technology is great, but also what are the ancient ways we can think about. So at the same time as that, you're thinking of how can you look outside of your sector for a new perspective, a new opportunity, a new theme to hold on to. How can you also look within your sector to connect with someone who's already doing the work with you, right? Don't reinvent the wheel. Who are the fellow partners, fellow organization, fellow community groups that you can work with to go faster, right? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together, right? I think that's an African proverb. So I think that is very, very apt in the conversation that we're having today, but also in in life in general. When we look outside of this conversation and the broader theme, I think that is what we all need to work to walk away with, right? And I just encourage each of you. I absolutely love these opportunities to connect with the ADN network, bring us together to have these really critical discussions. But I always tell everyone, if you leave this discussion in this room, then all we did was talk, right? How do you put that into action? So I encourage you, everyone has been sharing their LinkedIn in the chats. People have been sharing a wealth of information in the chats. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Tokumbo. Thank you, Tala, and all the other people who asked questions. Please, 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 if the only thing you do after this call is connect with one new person, then you have turned this into more than just a discussion, but an action, right? Because as Tokumbo mentioned, the power of networking is immense. And even if all you do is, connect with them on LinkedIn, 2, 3 weeks, 5 months, 1 year from now, they might post something that is going to be a game changer for you. So I just really encourage you to go ahead and take that action now while I am closing up. And so in closing, I know my colleague Rose, I believe you might have already shared it, Rose, but in the chats, I'm going to share with you 2 things to take away in addition to the points I just gave you. As I mentioned, ADN runs an accelerator program. So tomorrow we are closing the application for our Builders of Africa's Future program. This is an enterprise accelerator for entrepreneurs who are based in the African continent. I see a few of our alumni on this call today, actually. Sister Rose, great to see you. And then Chris, he's from our ABLE cohort, so that's the sister program to BAF. That's for entrepreneurs based in the US. We sign them up with mentors, training, access to capital. They have the opportunity to pitch. I love that PAM platform that you mentioned, Bayina. That sounds wonderful. And so all our entrepreneurs get an opportunity to practice with their facilitators and their mentors, their pitching, and then get to pitch to ADN's network. So I really encourage those of you who are either entrepreneurs yourself or know entrepreneurs who would benefit from the ADN Builders of Africa's Future program, please, please, please share the link with them so that they can apply. The doors close tomorrow, but just a quick secret, anyone who starts their application tomorrow will give them an extension till Monday. So that's a secret between us. So you can just let them know that if you're sharing with them today and they're like, oh, it's going to close tomorrow, tell them to start. I have already asked Rose to please be nice to anyone who gets started and give them till Monday to finish, but they have to start tomorrow to get that grace period. And then finally, I need to invite you all to our African Diaspora Investment Symposium. Patty mentioned it earlier. This is going to be in Washington, D.C., where Anika is based. So it's going to be an amazing opportunity to continue these types of conversation, but in person. I think there is a real power in connecting one-on-one, seeing the beautiful dresses that people are wearing, understanding where people are from. And I think what is going to be amazing about Addis this year, two things. One, we are talking specifically about going beyond remittances. What are the different ways that the diaspora can contribute in a sustainable and transformational way to developing the African continent and the communities that the diaspora lives in, right? The diaspora is always going to be sending remittances. No one's going to stop me from sending remittances to my grandma. Okay, you're not taking that. But what we can do is encourage each other to, send investments, send donations to organizations that we might not necessarily be, our cousins or our brothers. What are the sustainable, what are the impactful organizations working day in and day out to build Africa's future, right? How do we create mechanisms for enabling transformational investments on the continent? We're going to have policymakers there, researchers there, entrepreneurs there, investors, diaspora. It's going to be a wonderful opportunity to network, but it's also going to be a wonderful opportunity to celebrate. I'm really looking forward to an interactive session that we're going to have on Friday, where we're going to be talking about the different linkages between our food, our art, our music. We have an amazing Afro-Caribbean chef who was talking to us about food that is like Afro-Caribbean, but you see the roots in, West Africa and East Africa. And so it's just really, when you look at a chicken and the way that people, prepare plantain, these cultures that I think, Henrietta, you mentioned how resilient African cultures have been over the years. These are cultures that were sustained over, violent histories. People maintain them anyways. And so we're going to get an opportunity to experience that at Addis. So I really encourage you all to come, and I hope to see many of you there. And so without further ado, thank you all so much for being here. It has been an honor. Patty, you are a fantastic moderator. Patty was our MC for Addis, and she was fantastic. So yes, thank you so much, Patty. You really moved us well through the conversation. Henrietta, it was amazing to learn from you, to learn from your wisdom and the amazing work that you all are doing with the Beehive and the shared experiences. Anika, everybody, I have to admit that Anika is basically my big sister. I have been looking for an excuse to work with Anika for a while, grew up in Southern Maryland. So just so great to, continue to see you work, Anika. It's amazing. And I'm so grateful that you accepted to come talk today. Always inspiring to learn from you and the way that you continue to uplift Black and brown businesses, not just in DC, but around the world. So thank you for your work. And Bayina, you already know that once Tokumba told me that you could be a potential speaker, I would not accept any other suggestions that Tokumba gave for this role. I said, no, it must be Bayina who speaks because she literally saves Black lives. She's the one we want to hear from. So thank you to our panelists, and thank you to the amazing audience for being here today. Thank you.